Hello, welcome to Jessie at Home. In this video I'm going to show you how to make the Askew wrap. The Askew wrap that's seen in the photos attached to this video and right here in front of you is made with JoJo Land Melody Superwash, which is 100% wool, and the color I used is MS82. Alright, I'm actually going to make the video using just some worsted weight yarn that I had in my stash of just extra yarn hanging about, because it's going to be a little easier for you to see for the video. But this is what I used for my final project here, and attached to this video you can find links to where you can purchase this yarn and also links to the pattern written out. The written out pattern actually is written for rows 1 through 19. And what happens is once you get to rows 16, 17, 18, and 19 are your repeat rows. You start off with some individual rows to kind of grow up to the point where we can where the pattern can be written in a repeat sort of fashion. Alright, so we're going to just work all the way through row 19 on this video. I'll remind you when we get to row 16 that is the beginning of the repeat section, and you will get the idea of how to make this wrap, because once you get to row 19 you're just repeating rows 16 to 19 until the wrap is the size that you want. So you see what happens here is it just continues to grow, and it's actually growing on one side, and then at a little bit of a slower rate it's shrinking on the other side, and that's what's giving it this really kind of askew look to the triangle until you get to the point where it's much longer. And this right here is actually this is the row. You work back and forth. You can see how the color goes across the wrap. That is the direction that your rows are being worked. So you can see you start off with a teeny tiny row and your rows just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And if you're using a self-striping yarn or variegated yarn like this, the color sections get smaller because your rows are getting larger. So at the beginning, you know, one color section is really wide, and here's the next color section. So you see how wide these color changes are, and then by the time you get to the end, look how narrow the color changes are. And that's one of the really fun things about this pattern being done in a variegated yarn, is the way that the size of the color changes change. Okay, let's begin. I'm actually going to show you this pattern in little chunks. Okay, first we're going to do rows 1 through 7. And then we're going to do rows 8 through 11, then 12 through 15, and then 16 through 19. And when I explain rows 16 through 19, I'm going to make sure you understand the pattern and how that it repeats, because rows 16 through 19 then repeat. They grow. So the stitch count is not the same, but if you understand the pattern at that point, you can keep going. It doesn't need to be written any farther or explained any farther, because by then you will have gotten the idea of how the repeats work, the increases and the decreases. Okay? So we're going to begin with row 1. And row 1 is pretty simple. We put a slip knot on our hook. Okay? Now you chain 2. And now you are going to work a single chain 2 single into the second chain from the hook, which is the very first chain that you made, right? See that one there? You're going to place a single chain 2 single. Single, chain 2, single. Doesn't matter which part of that chain you work into, as long as you work into it. That's it. That is row 1. Now we're turning for row 2. We are going to place a single chain 2 single in the very first stitch. Okay, so here's the loop on our hook, and then there's the next stitch, the next loop. That is our first stitch. We're not doing a chain, we're just going straight into that first stitch and making our first single, chain 2, and single. Now we are also going to make a single chain 2 single into the next chain 2 space. Single, chain 2, single. That's the end of of row 2. You have 2 sets of single, chain 2, single. Turn. Row 3 is single, chain 2, single in each of these chain 2 spaces. We have 2 chain 2 spaces. So we're going to go into the first chain 2 space, single, chain 2, single, and into the second chain 2 space, single, chain 2, single. There you have row 3. Row 4. We are going to increase on this side again, which is a single, chain 2, single into the first stitch. So we're not going all the way over into the chain 2 space. We're going into this first stitch. Here's the loop on the hook. Here's the next loop. That's the first stitch. Single, chain 2, single. Now you're going to place a single crochet into the next chain 2 space. You're then going to chain 2, and then you're going over to the next chain 2 space and placing another single crochet. And that actually we made an increase over here, but then we also made a decrease. So this row stayed the same size. There's still 2 of the chain 2 sets. It just scooched over that way a little bit. Okay, and as this gets bigger, you'll start to see that a little bit more. Now we're turning for row 5. We're going to single, chain 2, single in each chain 2 space, which there's only 2 of. So let's do that. Single, chain 2, single, single, chain 2, single. Row 6, we're going to turn, and we are going to single, chain 2, single in the very first stitch. So again, loop on your hook, next loop, that's the first stitch, single, chain 2, single, and then single, chain 2, single in each chain 2 space. There's 2 of them. Single, chain 2, single, and single, chain 2, single. Okay, so you now have 3 sets of single, chain 2, single. Turn, and row 7. You are going to place a single, chain 2, single into each chain 2 space. There are 3 of them. Single, chain 2, single. Single, chain 2, single, and single, chain 2, single. So you can see that is those are rows 1 through 7. Alright, this is obviously a little chunkier than the original, than the sample in the pictures, and that is fine. The reason I'm using this thicker, heavier yarn is so you can see it better in the video, okay? Though there's really no reason why you couldn't try making this with a thicker, heavier yarn. It's just, you'll see, obviously, has a different look. Alright, so that is those are rows 1 through 7. Okay, let's look at rows 8 through 11 now. Like I said, I'm just doing these in little chunks, and that way if you get lost somewhere along the way, it's easier for you to stop and back up into a workable chunk instead of having to keep trying to figure out where you are. Okay, so rows 8 through 11. That was row 7. Row 8 we turn, and we're going to place an increase on this end and a decrease on that end. So we're going to start off by placing the single, chain 2, single into the very first stitch. So just as before, there's the loop on the hook, and then there's the next loop right there, and that is our first stitch. So we are putting a single, a chain 2, and a single. Now you're also going to place a single, chain 2, single into the very next chain 2 space. Single, chain 2, single, and there's 2 chain 2 spaces left, right? We're going to place a single in this one, we're going to chain 2, and we're going to place a single in the last one. And that is row 8. For row 9, we turn. Oh, my computer screen went away on me, and I have this pattern memorized, but I still like to look at it just so I don't make mistakes. Okay, row 9. Single, chain 2, single into each chain 2 space, and there are 3 of them. Single, chain 2, single, and the next one. single, chain 2, single, and the last one. Single, chain 2, single. Row 10, turn. You're going to single, chain 2, single into the very first space, which is an increase, right? That's how we do our increases. And then single, chain 2, single into each chain 2 space across, including this very next one that's right next to where we just worked. Okay, so this is our row 9. Oh, that I just am splitting yarn. I'm sorry, that's not our row 9, that's our row 10. Now we are going to turn, and for row 11 we are going to place a single, chain 2, single into each and every chain 2 space. There are 4 of them since we just did that increase, right? So row 11, single, chain 2, single once, single, chain 2, single twice, single, chain 2, single 3 times, and single, chain 2, single 4 times. And that is the end of row 11. So you can see we have 4 more rows now added onto this from the last point that we stopped, and you can already start to see how it is growing on this side, and at a slower rate it's coming in on this side. Okay? Okay, we've completed through row 11, and now we're going to look at rows 12 through 15. So we are going to turn, and for row 12 we are going to we're going to place an increase and a decrease in this row. We start with an increase, we end with a decrease. So that means we're going to place a single, chain 2, single into our first stitch, and that works as our increase. Single, chain 2, single. And then we single, chain 2, single into the next chain 2 space. Single, chain 2, single into the next chain 2 space. And then you can see that there's 2 chain 2 spaces left, right? We are going to place a single in the next one. We are going to chain 2 and place a single in the last one. And that is the end of row 12. There are still only 4 chain 2 spaces. Now we turn, and for row 13 we place a single, chain 2, single into each chain 2 space. There's only 4 of them. Okay, single, chain 2, single into each one. If you hear a funny scratching noise, it's because I'm in the basement, and in the living room my children are on spring break, and I believe they are coloring on the floor. Not on the actual floor. They probably have a coloring book, but it sounds very interesting from down here. They're trying so hard to be quiet. Alright, now we're going to turn and work on row 14. Row 14 starts with an increase, but does not have a decrease. So we are going to single crochet into the first stitch, chain 2, and single crochet again. So that was a single crochet, chain 2, single crochet in the first stitch, and then single crochet, chain 2, single into each of the chain 2 spaces across. Alrighty, that's 3 of them, and that's 4, and then 1 more will make 5, and you'll see we have 5 sets of single, chain 2, single at the end of row 14. Okay. Now let's look at row 15. We turn, and we single crochet, single into each chain 2 space across. And like I said, there are 5 of them. So single, chain 2, single into each of these 5. And then we'll look at the next 4 rows, and the next 4 rows is when we'll really talk about how to continue this pattern for as long as you want, until you run out of yarn, until it's the size you want, whatever you want to decide makes the end of your wrap. 1, 2, and single, and that is the end of row 15. Okay, so now let's look at rows 16 through 19. And these are the repeat rows, so you need to really make sure that you understand what happens here. And let me explain it to you first. What happens is every single odd row, you're just going to single crochet single into each, single crochet single, single chain two single into each chain two space across on all the odd rows. That's pretty much the way that it works. Then on the even rows, you will increase on this side on every single even row, and you'll decrease on this side on every other even row. Okay, and so let's look at what that actually means. Row 16, which is the first of your 4 repeat rows, is an increase on this side and a decrease on that side. Okay, an increase at the beginning and a decrease at the end. So for the increase at the beginning, you single chain two single into the first stitch. And that makes your increase, right? And that's at the beginning of every single even row. Now, you are going to single chain two single into each chain two space until there's only 2 of them left. So let's do that. Single, chain two, single, single, chain two, single, and one more. Single, chain two, single. And now you can see there are only 2 chain two spaces left. When there's only 2 left, then what you do is you place a single crochet, then you chain 2, and then in the last one you place a single crochet. And that made your decrease. So you can see we increased on this side and we decreased on that side. And that is the first of our 4 repeat rounds. Increase on this side, decrease on this side. Now we turn, and for row 17, which is the second of our repeat rows, we just single crochet, single chain two, single. I keep splitting this yarn. Single chain two, single into each chain two space across. Okay, so there we go. Row 17, which is our second repeat row. All right, chain two, single, and single, chain two, single. Now let's turn and let's look at row 18, which is our third repeat row. And for row 18, we are going to increase on this side, and that's all. No decrease, just an increase on this side. So the increase is a single, chain two, single in the very first stitch, and then we single chain two single in each chain two across. And that is row 18, also known as the third of our repeat rows. I'm probably saying round in place of row several times, and I'm very sorry if I am. I sometimes use them interchangeably because I kind of do half and half as to whether or not I'm working a round or a row. Okay, chain two and single. Okay, and now for the last of our repeat rows, for row 19, it is plain old single chain two single into each chain two space across. So why don't we do that, and then we'll look at it and wrap things up. Get it? Wrap? Yeah, I'm funny. Well, at least I amuse myself, and you know, since I'm the only one down here. Alrighty, almost 2 more. Single, chain two, single, and single, chain two, single. Okay, so there we have it. We have completed row 19. And you can see how every other row we are increasing, right? At the beginning of every other row, we increase. So there's always an increase on every other row on this side. Every 4th row, we're decreasing, and that's what makes these little holes. And so this side is increasing on half of the rows, and this side is decreasing on only a 1/4 of the rows. And that's what gives it this kind of wonky shape. It's moving this way at a twice as fast as it's moving this way, which is what gives it this kind of wedged look. All right, and you can even see, even with the smaller yarn, you can see that these are the increased sides and these are the decreased side. This is the side that was always increased. This is the side that was always decreased. And you can still see every fourth row, you can see a little bit of a, you can see the little hole created by the decrease, by where we kind of skipped over one of those chain 2 spaces. Okay, so you can see those little holes that are created, which I think gives it a really pretty kind of eyelet looking edging to it, and it gives it a kind of uneven little bump. And of course, the bigger the yarn you use, the more pronounced those things, the chunkier your yarn, the more pronounced those little bumps and the little holes will be. So there you have it. You can repeat those last 4 rows to your heart's content to make yourself an Askew wrap. Thank you for watching.